Hello, and thanks for joining me back here at St Helier in Jersey, British Channel Island. Lovely day to sit down here by the marina, and hopefully you've just already listened to the prologue and the author's note of this new book I'm reading called The Wager by David Grann. Um, really apt, I think, to sit next to the sea to read this nautical tale of non-fiction. Behind me, over there, the Elizabeth Castle, a perfect backdrop to this story. So I'm going to go straight into what is part one of the wager, part one entitled The Wooden World, and chapter one, The First Lieutenant. Each man in the squadron carried, along with the sea chest, his own burdensome story. Perhaps it was of a scorned love, or a secret prison conviction, or a pregnant wife left on shore weeping. Perhaps it was a hunger of fame or fortune, and a dread of death. David Cheap, the first lieutenant of the Centurion, the squadron's flagship, was no different. A burly Scotsman in his early 40s, with a protracted nose and intense eyes, he was in flight from squabbles with his brother over their inheritance, from creditors chasing him, from debts that made it impossible for him to find a suitable bride. On shore, Cheap seemed doomed, unable to navigate past life's unexpected shoals. Yet as he perched on the quarterdeck of a British man-of-war cruising the vast oceans with a Crockett hat and spyglass, he brimmed with confidence, even, some would say, a touch of haughtiness. The wooden world of a ship, and a world bound by the Navy's rigid regulations and the laws of the sea, and most of all by the hardened fellowship of men, had privileged him a refuge. Suddenly he felt a crystalline order, clarity of purpose, and Cheap's newest posting, despite the innumerable risks that it carried, from plagues and drowning to enemy cannon fire, offered what he longed for, a chance to finally claim a wealthy prize and rise to captain his own ship, becoming a lord of the sea. The problem was that he could not get away from the damned land. He was trapped, cursed, really, at the dockyard in Portsmouth, along the English Channel, struggling with feverish futility to get the Centurion fitted out and ready to sail. Its massive wooden hull, 144 feet long and 40 feet wide, was moored at a slip. Carpenters, caulkers, riggers, and joiners combed over its decks like rats, which were so plentiful, a cacophony of hammers and saws. The cobblestone streets past the shipyard were congested with rattling wheelbarrows and horse-drawn wagons, with porters, peddlers, pickpockets, sailors, and prostitutes. Periodically, a boatswain blew a chilling whistle, and crewmen stumbled from ale shops, parting from their old or new sweethearts, hurrying to their departing ships in order to avoid their officers' lashes. It was January 1740, and the British Empire was racing to mobilise for war against its imperial rival Spain. And in a move that had suddenly raised Cheap's prospects, the captain under whom he served on the Centurion, George Anson, had been plucked by the Admiralty to be a commodore and lead the squadron of 5 ships against the Spanish. The promotion was unexpected. As the son of an obscure country squire, Anson did not wield the level of patronage, the grease or interest of what it was more politely called, that propelled many officers up the pole along with their men. Anson, then 42, had joined the Navy at the age of 14 and served for nearly 3 decades without leading a major military campaign or snaring a lucrative prize. Tall, with a long face and a high forehead, he had a remoteness about him. His blue eyes were inscrutable, and the outside company of a few trusted friends he rarely opened his mouth. One statesman, after meeting with him, noted, "Anson, as usual, said little." Anson corresponded even more sparingly, as if he doubted the ability of words to convey what he saw or felt. He loved reading little, and writing or dictating his own letters less, and that seeming negligence drew upon him the will of many. A relative wrote, "A diplomat later quipped that Anson was so unknowing about the world that he had been round it but never in it." Nevertheless, the Admiralty had recognised in Anson what Cheap had also seen in him the 2 years since he joined the Centurion's crew, a formidable seaman. Anson had a mastery of the wooden world, and equally important, a mastery of himself. He remained cool and steady under duress. His relative noted he had high notions of sincerity and honour, and practised them without deviation. In addition to Cheap, he had attracted a coterie of talented junior officers and protégés, all vying for his favour. one later informed Anson that he was more obliged to him than to his own father, and would do anything to act up to the good opinion you are pleased to have of me. If Anson succeeded in his new role as Commodore of the squadron, he would be in a position to anoint any captain he wanted, and Cheap, who'd initially served as Anson's second lieutenant, was now his right-hand man. Like Anson, Cheap had spent much of his life at sea, a bruising existence he'd at first hoped to escape. As Samuel Johnson once observed, no man will be a sailor who has contrivance enough to give himself into jail, for being in a ship is being in a jail, with the chance of being drowned. Cheap's father had possessed a large estate in Fife, Scotland, and one of those titles, the second Laird of Rosse, that evoked nobility, even if not quite confer it. His motto, emblazoned on the family's crest, was Ditat Virtus, virtue and riches. He had 7 children with his first wife, and after she had died, he had 6 more with his second, among them David. In 1705, the year that David celebrated his 8th birthday, his father stepped out to fetch some goat's milk and dropped dead. As was custom, it was the oldest male heir, David's half-brother, James, who inherited the bulk of the estate. And so David was buffeted by forces beyond his control, in a world divided between first sons and younger sons, between the haves and have-nots. Compounding his upheaval, James had now ensconced as the 3rd Laird of Rosse, frequently neglected to pay the allowance that had been bequeathed to his half-brothers and half-sister. Some blood was apparently thicker than others. Driven to find work, David had apprenticed to a merchant, but his debts mounted. So in 1714, the year he turned 17, he ran off to sea, a decision that was evidently welcomed by his family, as his guardian wrote to his older brother, "The sooner he goes off, it will be better for you and me." After these setbacks, Cheap seemed only more consumed by his festering dreams, more determined to bend what he called an unhappy fate on his own, on an ocean distant from the world he knew. He might prove himself in elemental struggles, braving typhoons, out-dueling enemy ships, rescuing his companions from calamities. But though Cheap had chased a few pirates, including the one-handed Irishman Henry Johnson, who fired his gun by resting the barrel on his stump, these earlier voyages had proved largely uneventful. He'd been sent to patrol the West Indies, generally considered the worst assignment in the Navy because of the spectre of disease. The saffron scourge, the bloody flux, the break-bone fever, the Blue Death. But Cheap had endured. Wasn't there something to be said for that? Moreover, he'd earned the trust of Anson and worked his way up to first lieutenant. No doubt it helped that they shared a disdain for reckless banter, or what Cheap seemed a vapouring manner. A Scottish minister, who later became close to Cheap, noted that Anson had employed him because he was a man of sense and knowledge. Cheap, the once forlorn debtor, was one but wrung from his coveted captaincy, and with the war with Spain having broken out, he was about to head into full-fledged battle for the first time. The conflict was the result of endless jockeying among the European powers to expand their empires. They each vied to conquer or control even larger swathes of the earth, so that they could exploit and monopolize other nations' valuable natural resources and trade markets. In the process, they subjugated and destroyed innumerable indigenous peoples, justifying their ruthless self-interest, including the reliance on the ever-expanding Atlantic slave trade, by claiming that they were somehow spreading civilization to the benighted realms of the earth. Spain had long been the dominant empire in Latin America, but Great Britain, which had already possessed colonies along the American eastern seaboard, was now on the ascendant and determined to break its rival's hold. Then, in 1738, Robert Jenkins, a British merchant captain, was summoned to appear in Parliament, where he reportedly claimed that a Spanish officer had stormed his brig in the Caribbean and accused him of smuggling sugar from Spain's colonies and cut off his left ear. Jenkins reputedly displayed his several appendage pickled in a jar and pledged "my cause to my country." The incident further ignited the passions of Parliament and pamphleteers, leading people to cry for blood, an ear for an ear, a good deal of booty as well. The conflict became known as the War of Jenkins's Ear. British authorities soon devised a plan to launch an attack on the hub of Spain's colonial wealth, Cartagena, a South American city on the Caribbean. It was where much of the silver extracted from Peruvian mines was shipped in armed convoys to Spain. The British offensive, involving a massive fleet of 186 ships, led by Admiral Edward Vernon, would be the largest amphibious assault in history, but there was also another, much smaller operation, the one assigned to Commodore Anson. With 5 warships and a scouting sloop, he and some 2,000 men would sail across the Atlantic and around Cape Horn, taking, sinking, burning, or otherwise destroying enemy ships and weakening Spanish holdings from the Pacific coast of South America to the Philippines. The British government, in concocting its scheme, wanted to avoid the impression that it was merely sponsoring piracy. Yet the heart of the plan called for an act of outright thievery to snatch a Spanish galleon loaded with virgin silver and hundreds of thousands of silver coins. Twice a year, Spain sent such a galleon. It was not always the same ship from Mexico to the Philippines to purchase silks and spices and other Asian commodities, which in turn were sold in Europe and the Americas. These exchanges provided crucial links in Spain's global trading empire. Cheap and the others, ordered to carry out the mission, were rarely privy to the agendas of those in power, but they were lured by a tantalizing prospect, a share of the treasure. The Centurion's 22-year-old chaplain, Reverend Richard Walter, who later compiled an account of the voyage, described the galleon as the most desirable prize that was to be met in any part of the globe. If Anson and his men prevailed, if it shall please God to bless our arms, as the Admiralty put it, they would continue circling the earth before returning home. The Admiralty had given Anson a code and a cipher to use for his written communication, and an official warned that the mission must be carried out in the most secret, expeditious manner. Otherwise, Anson's squadron might be intercepted and destroyed by a large Spanish armada being assembled under the command of Don Jose Pizarro. Cheap was facing his longest expedition. He might be gone for 3 years and his most perilous, but he saw himself as a knight-errant of the sea in search of the greatest prize of all the oceans, and along the way he might become a captain yet. Yet if the squadron didn't embark quickly, Cheap feared, the entire party would be annihilated by a force even more dangerous than the Spanish Armada. The violent seas around Cape Horn, only a few British sailors had successfully made this passage, where winds routinely blow at gale force, waves can climb to nearly 100 feet, and icebergs lurk in the hollows. Seamen thought that the best chance to survive was during the austral summer, between December and February. Reverend Walter cited the essential maxim, explained that during winter, not only were the seas fiercer and the temperatures freezing, that there were fewer hours of daylight in which one could discern the uncharted coastline. All these reasons, he argued, would make navigating around this unknown shore the most dismaying and terrible. But since war had been declared in October 1739, the Centurion and the other men of the war in the squadron, including the Gloucester, the Pearl, and the Severn, had been marooned in England, waiting to be repaired and fitted out for their next journey. Cheap watched helplessly as the days ticked by. January 1740 came and went, then February and March. It was nearly half a year since the war with Spain had been declared. Still, the squadron was not ready to sail. It should have been an imposing force. Men of war were among the most sophisticated machines yet, buoyant wooden castles powered across oceans by wind and sail, reflecting the dual nature of their creators. They were devised to be both murderous instruments and the homes in which hundreds of sailors lived together as a family. In a lethal floating chess game, these pieces were deployed around the globe to achieve what Sir Walter Raleigh had envisioned. Whosoever commands the seas commands the trade of the world. Whoever commands the trade of the world commands the riches of the world. Cheap knew what a cracking ship the Centurion was, swift and stout, and weighing about 1,000 tons. She had, like the other warships in Anson's squadron, 3 towering masts with criss-crossing yards, wooden spars from which the sails unfurled. The Centurion would fly as many as 18 sails at a time. Its hull gleamed with varnish, and painted around the stern, in gold relief, were Greek mythological figures, including Poseidon. On the bow rode a 16-foot wooden carving of a lion, painted bright red. To increase the chances of surviving a barrage of cannonballs, the hull had a double layer of planks, giving it a thickness of more than a foot in places. The ship had several decks, each stacked up the next, and the 2 of them had rows of cannons on both sides, their menacing black muzzles pointing out of square gun ports. Augustus Keppel, a 15-year-old midshipman who was one of Anson's protégés, boasted that the other men of war had no chance in the world against the mighty Centurion. Yet building, repairing and fitting out these watercraft was a Herculean endeavour, even in the best of times, and in a period of war it was chaos. The royal dockyards, which were among the largest manufacturing sites in the world, were overwhelmed with ships, leaking ships, half-constructed ships, ships needed to be loaded and unloaded. Anson's vessels were laid up on what was known as Rotten Row. As sophisticated as men of war were, with their sail propulsion and lethal gunnery, they were largely made from simple, perishable materials, hemp, canvas, and most of all, timber. Constructing a single large warship could require as many as 4,000 trees, and 100 acres of forest might be felled. Most of the wood was hard oak, but it was still susceptible to the pulverizing elements of storm and sea. Teredo nivalis, a reddish shipworm which can grow longer than a foot, ate through holes. Columbus lost 2 ships of these creatures during his 4th voyage to the West Indies. Termites had also bored through decks and masts and cabin doors, as did deadwatch beetles. A species of fungus further devoured the ship's wooden core. In 1684, Samuel Pepys, a secretary to the Admiralty, was stunned to discover that many new warships under construction were already so rotten they were in danger of sinking at their very moorings. The average man of war was estimated by a leading shipwright to last only 14 years, and to survive that long, a ship had to be virtually remade after each extensive voyage with new masts and sheathing and rigging. Otherwise, it risked disaster. In 1782, while the 180-foot Royal George, for a time the largest warship in the world, was anchored near Portsmouth, with a full crew on board, water began flooding its hull, and it sank. The cause has been disputed, but an investigation blamed the general state of decay of her timbers. An estimated 900 people drowned. Cheap learned that an inspection of the Centurion had turned up the usual array of sea wounds. A shipwright reported that the wooden sheathing on its hull was so much worm-eaten that it had to be taken off and replaced. The foremast toward the bow contained a rotten cavity a foot deep, and the sails were, as Anson noted in his log, much rat-eaten. The squadron's other 4 warships faced similar problems. Moreover, each vessel had to be loaded with tons of provisions, including some 40 miles of rope, more than 15,000 square feet of sails, and a farm's worth of livestock, chickens, pigs, goats, and cattle. It could be fiercely difficult to get such animals on board. Steers do not like the water, a British captain complained. Cheap pleaded with the naval administration to finishing readying the Centurion, but it was that familiar story of wartime. Through much of the country had clamoured for battle, the people were unwilling to pay enough for it, and the navy was strained to a breaking point. Cheap could be a volatile, his moods shifting like the winds, and here he was, stuck as a landsman, a pen pusher. He badgered dockyard officials to replace the Centurion's damaged mast, but they insisted the cavity could simply be patched. Cheap wrote to the Admiralty decrying this was a very strange way of reasoning, and officials eventually relented, but more time was lost. And where was that bastard of the fleet, the Wager? Unlike other men of war, it was not born for battle, but had been a merchant vessel, a so-called East Indiaman, because it traded in that region. Intended for heavy cargo, it was tubby and unwieldy, a 123-foot eyesore. After the war began, the Navy, needing additional ships, had purchased it from the East India Company for nearly £4,000. Since then, it had been sequestered 80 miles northeast of Portsmouth at Deptford, a royal dockyard on the Thames, where it was undergoing a metamorphosis. Cabins were torn apart, holes cut into the outer walls, and a stairwell obliterated. The Wager's captain, Dandy Kidd, surveyed the work being done. 56 years old, and reportedly a descendant of the infamous buccaneer William Kidd, he's an experienced seaman and a superstitious one. He saw portents lurking in the winds and the waves. Only recently he had obtained what Cheap dreamed of, the command of his own ship. At least from Cheap's perspective, Kidd had earned his promotion, unlike the captain of the Gloucester, Richard Norris, whose father, Sir John Norris, was a celebrated admiral. Sir John had helped to secure his son a position in the squadron, noting that there would be both action and good fortune to those who survived. The Gloucester was the only vessel in the squadron being swiftly repaired, prompting another captain to complain, "I lay 3 weeks in the dock, and not a nail drove, because Sir John Norris's son must first be served." Captain Kidd bore his own story. He'd left behind at a boarding school a 5-year-old son, also named Dandy, who had no mother to raise him. What would happen to him if his father didn't survive the voyage? Already Captain Kidd feared the omens. In his log he wrote that his new ship nearly tumbled over, and he warned the Admiralty that she might be a crank, a ship that heeled abnormally. To give the hull ballast so the ship wouldn't capsize, more than 400 tons of pig iron and gravel stones were lowered through the hatches into the dark, dank, cavernous hold. The workers toiled through one of England's coldest winters on the record, and just as the Wager had ready to sail, Cheap learned to his dismay something extraordinary happened. The Thames froze, shimmering from bank to bank with thick, unbreakable waves of ice. An official at Deptford had advised the Admiralty that the Wager was imprisoned until the river melted. 2 months passed before she was liberated. In May, the old East Indiaman finally emerged from the Deptford dock as a man of war. The Navy classified warships by their number of cannons, and with 28, she was a 6th rate, the lowest rank. She was christened in honour of Sir Charles Wager, the 74-year-old First Lord of the Admiralty. The ship's name seemed fitting. Weren't they all gambling with their lives? As the Wager was piloted down the Thames, drifting with the tides along that central highway of trade, she floated past West Indiamen loaded with sugar and rum from the Caribbean, past East Indiamen with silks and spices from Asia, and past blubber hunters returning from the Arctic with whale oil for lanterns and soaps. While the Wager was navigating this traffic, her keel ran aground on a shoal. Imagine being shipwrecked here, but it soon dislodged, and in July, the ship arrived at last outside Portsmouth Harbour, where Cheap laid eyes upon her. Seamen were merciless oglers of passing ships, pointing out their elegant curves on their hideous flaws. And though the Wager had assumed the proud look of a man of war, she could not completely conceal her former self, and Captain Kidd beseeched the Admiralty, even at this late date, to give the vessel a fresh coat of varnish and paint, that she could shine like the other ships. By the middle of July, 9 bloodless months had gone by since the war began. If the squadron left promptly, Cheap was confident that it could reach Cape Horn before the end of the austral summer. But the men of war were still missing the most important element of all: men. Because of the length of the voyage and the planned amphibious invasions, each warship in Anson's squadron was supposed to carry an even greater number of seamen and marines than it was designed for. The Centurion, which typically held 400 people, was expected to sail with some 500, and the Wager would be packed with about 250, nearly double its usual complement. Cheap had waited and waited for crewmen to arrive, but the Navy had exhausted its supply of volunteers, and Great Britain had no military conscription. Robert Walpole, the country's first Prime Minister, warned that the dearth of crews had rendered a third of the Navy's ships unusable. "Oh, seamen, seamen, seamen," he cried at a meeting. While Cheap was struggling with other officers to scrounge up sailors for his squadron, he received more unsettling news. Those men who had been recruited were falling sick. Their heads throbbed and their limbs were so sore they felt as if they'd been pummeled. In several cases, these symptoms were compounded by diarrhea, vomiting, bursting blood vessels, and fevers reaching as high as 106 degrees. This led to delirium, catching at imaginary objects in the air, as a medical treatise put it. Some men succumbed even before they had gone to sea. Cheap counted at least 200 sick and more than 25 dead on the Centurion alone. He had brought his young nephew, Henry, to apprentice on the expedition, and what if he perished? Even Cheap, who was so indomitable, was suffering from what he called a very indifferent state of health. It was a devastating epidemic of ship's fever, now known as typhus. No one then understood what the disease was, that the disease was a bacterial infection transmitted by lice and other vermin. As boats transported unwashed recruits, crammed together in filth, the men became lethal vectors, more deadly than a cascade of cannonballs. Anson instructed Cheap to have the sick rushed to a makeshift hospital in Gosport near Portsmouth, in the hope that they would recover in time for the voyage. The squadron still desperately needed men, but as the hospital became overcrowded, most of the sick had to be lodged in surrounding taverns, which offered more liquor than medicine, and there were 3 patients sometimes had to squeeze into a single cot. An admiral noted, "In this miserable way, they die very fast." After peaceful efforts to man the fleets failed, the Navy resorted to what a secretary of the Admiralty called a more violent strategy. Armed gangs were dispatched to press seafaring men into service, in effect kidnapping them. The gangs roamed cities and towns, grabbing anyone who betrayed the telltale signs of mariner: the familiar checkered shirt and wide-knee trousers and round hat, the fingers smeared with tar, which used to make virtually everything on a ship more water-resistant and durable. Seamen were known as tars. Local authorities were ordered to seize all straggling seamen, watermen, bargemen, fishermen, and lightermen. A seaman later described walking in London and having a stranger tap him on the shoulder and demand, "What ship?" The seaman denied that he was a sailor, but his tar-stained fingertips betrayed him. The stranger blew his whistle. In an instant posse appeared. I was in the hands of 6 or 8 ruffians, whom I soon found to be a press gang, the seaman wrote. They dragged me hurriedly through the several streets, amid bitter execrations bestowed on them from passers-by and expressions of sympathy directed towards me. Press gangs headed out in boats as well, scouring the horizon for incoming merchant ships, the most fertile hunting ground. Often men seized were returning from distant voyages and hadn't seen their families for years. Given risks of subsequent long voyage during war, they might never see them again. Cheap became close to a young midshipman on the Centurion named John Campbell, who had been pressed while serving on a merchant ship. A gang had invaded his vessel, and when he saw them hauling away an older man in tears, he stepped forward and offered himself up in place. The head of the press gang remarked, "I would rather have had a lad of a spirit than a blubbering man." Anson was said to have been so struck by Campbell's gallantry that he'd made him a midshipman. Most sailors, though, went to extraordinary lengths to evade the body snatchers, hiding in cramped holds, listing themselves as dead in monster blocks, and abandoning merchant ships before reaching a major port. When a press gang surrounded a church in London in 1755 in pursuit of a seaman inside, he managed, according to a newspaper report, to slip away, disguised in an old gentleman's long cloak, hood, and bonnet. Sailors who got snatched up were transported in the holds of small ships known as tenders, which resembled floating jails, with gratings bolted over the hatchways and marines standing guard with muskets and bayonets. In this place we spent the day following night, huddled together, for there was no room to sit or stand separate, one seaman recalled. Indeed, we were in a pitiable plight, for numbers of them were seasick, some retching, others were smoking, whilst many were so overcome by the stench that they fainted for the want of air. Family members, upon learning that a relative or son, or brother, or a husband, or a father had been apprehended, would often rush to where the tenders were departing, hoping to glimpse their loved ones. Samuel Pepys describes in his diary a scene of depressed sailors' wives gathering on a wharf near the Tower of London. "In my life I never did see such a natural expression of passion as I did hear in some women's bewailing themselves, and running to every parcel of men that were brought, one after another, to look for their husbands, and wept over every vessel that went off, thinking that they might be there, and looking after the ship as far as they could by moonlight, that it grieved me to the heart to hear them." Anson's squadron received scores of pressed men. Cheap processed at least 65 for the Centurion. However distasteful he might have found the press, he needed every sailor he could get. Yet the unwilling recruits deserted at the first opportunity, as did volunteers who were having misgivings. In a single day 30 men vanished from the 7. Of the 6 men sent to Gosport, countless took advantage of the lax security to flee, or as one admiral put it, go off as soon as they can crawl. Altogether, more than 240 men absconded from the squadron, including the Gloucester's chaplain. When Captain Kidd dispatched a press gang to find new recruits for the wager, 6 members of the gang itself deserted. Anson ordered the squadron to moor far enough outside Portsmouth harbour that swimming to freedom was impossible, a frequent tactic that led one trap seaman to write his wife, "I would give it all if it was 100 guineas, if I could get on shore. I only lays on the deck every night. There is no hopes of me getting to you. Do the best you can for the children, and God prosper you, till I come back." Cheap, who believed that a good sailor must possess honour, courage, steadiness, was undoubtedly appalled by the quality of the recruits who lingered. It was common for local authorities, knowing the unpopularity of the press, to dump their undesirables. But these conscripts were wretched, and the volunteers were very little better. An admiral described one bunch of recruits as being full of the pox, itch, lame, king's evil, and all other distempers from the hospitals at London, and will serve only to breed an infection in the ships for the rest. Most of them are thieves, housebreakers. Newgate prison, birds, and the very filth of London. He concluded, in all the form of wars I never saw a parcel of turned over men half so bad. In short, they are so very bad that I don't know how to describe it. To at least partly address the shortage of men, the government sent to Anson's squadron 143 Marines, who in those days were a branch of the army with their own officers. The Marines were supposed to help with land invasions and also lend a hand at sea. Yet they were such raw recruits that they had never set foot on a ship and didn't even know how to fire a weapon. The Admiralty admitted they were useless. In desperation, the Navy took the extreme step of rounding up for Anson's squadron 500 invalid soldiers from the Royal Hospital in Chelsea, a pensioners' home established in the 17th century for veterans who were old, lame, or infirm in the service of the Crown. Many were in their 60s and 70s, and they were rheumatic, hard of hearing, partially blind, suffering from convulsions, or missing an assortment of limbs. Given their ages and abilities, these soldiers had been deemed unfit for active service. Reverend Walter described them as the most decrepit and miserable objects that could be collected. As these invalids made their way to Portsmouth, nearly half slipped away, including one who hobbled off on a wooden leg. All those who had limbs and strength to walk out of Portsmouth deserted. Reverend Walter noted. Anson pleaded with the Admiralty to replace what his chaplain called this aged and diseased detachment. No recruits were available, though, and after Anson dismissed some of the most infirm men, his superiors ordered them back on board. Cheap watched the incoming invalids, many of them so weak they had to be lifted onto the ships on stretchers. Their panicked faces betrayed what everyone secretly knew: they were sailing to their deaths. As Reverend Walter acknowledged, they would, in all probability, uselessly perish by lingering and painful diseases, and this too, after they had spent the activity and strength of their youth in their country's service. On August 23, 1740, after nearly a year of delays, the battle before the battle was over, with everything being in readiness to proceed on the voyage, as an officer of the Centurion wrote in his journal. Anson ordered Cheap to fire one of the guns. It was the signal for the squadron to unmoor, and the sound of the blast, the entire force, the five men of war, and an 80-foot scouting sloop, the Trial, as well as two small cargo ships, the Anna and the Industry, which would accompany them part way, stirred to life. Officers emerged from the quarters. Boatswains piped their whistles and cried, "All hands, all hands." Crewmen raced about extinguishing candles, lashing hammocks and loosening sails. Everything around Cheap, Anson's eyes and ears, seemed to be in motion, and then the ships began to move too. Farewell to the debt collectors, the invidious bureaucrats, the endless frustrations. Farewell to all of it. As the convoy made its way down the English Channel towards the Atlantic, it was surrounded by other departing ships, jockeying for wind and space. Several vessels collided, terrifying the uninitiated landsmen on board, and the wind, as fickle as the gods, abruptly shifted in front of them. Anson's squadron, unable to bear that close to the wind, was forced to return to its starting point. Twice more it embarked, only to retreat. On September 5th, the London Daily Post reported that the fleet was still waiting for a favourable wind. After all the trials and tribulations, Cheap's trials and tribulations, they seemed condemned to remain in this place. Yet on September 18, as the sun was going down, the seamen caught a propitious breeze. Even some of the recalcitrant recruits were relieved to be finally under way. At least they would have tasked to distract them, and now they would pursue that serpentine temptation, the galleon. The men were elevated with hopes of growing immensely rich. A seaman on the wager wrote in his journal, and in a few years of returning to Old England, loaded with the wealth of their enemies. Cheap assumed his commanding perch on the quarterdeck, an elevated platform by the stern that served as the officer's bridge, and that housed the steering wheel and a compass. He inhaled the salted air and listened to the splendid symphony around him, the rocking of the hull, the snapping of the halyards, the splashing of the waves against the prow. The ships glided in elegant formation, with the Centurion leading the way, her sails spread like wings. After a while, Anson ordered the red pendant signifying his rank as Commodore of the fleet to be hoisted, on the Centurion's main mast. The other captains had fired their guns 13 times each in salute. A thunderous clapping, a trail of smoke fading in the sky, the ships emerged from the channel, borne into the world anew, and Cheap, ever vigilant, saw the shore receding until at last he was surrounded by the deep blue sea. That is the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2 is entitled A Gentleman Volunteer, and we'll come back to that shortly. Interesting mention of Sir Walter Raleigh in that first chapter, and Sir Walter Raleigh himself was a governor of Jersey, where I am sitting today, some years ago. So an interesting and but very poignant place to read the first chapter of this book, The Wager. I can't wait to read the next chapters and find out what actually went on in that perilous journey. See you next time.